Even though most of the book is focused around an event that occurs in the last few years of World War II, the book The Assault by Harry Mulisch is also largely focused around the years that follow World War II and the cultural and political differences in the Netherlands at that time. An important aspect of Holland before the war was the idea of pillarization, or the idea that there should be different and separate institutions for the different religious and political societies. Before the war, there were four major pillars, being Orthodox Roman Catholic, Orthodox Protestant, the Dutch secular pillar, and the Dutch Social Democrats. Two important things to keep in mind were that there were no Jewish pillar, and that this system dated back to the 13th century. The reason why this is important is because we don't really know what pillar Anton belongs in until Anton's father tells us that they don't study in the name of God, but rather in the name of humanitas, implying that Anton most likely belongs in the secular pillar. At the time, members of the secular pillar were looked out as outcasts who didn't fit into the other pillars or into society in general. At the time of the assault, the Steenwijk family was going through hunger winter, which was the Dutch winter between 1944 and 1945 that mostly affected the unliberated western and northern Netherlands. As Anton himself puts it, almost all of Europe was rejoicing, eating, drinking, making love, and beginning to forget the war. But every day, Haarlem looked like one of those spent grain clinkers that they used to take out of the stove. At the time, Germans actually allowed Allied bombers to drop food for the hungry Dutch because it was at the very end of the war. As a result of the brutal treatment they had to go through, the Netherlands developed the Bakker-Schut Plan, which demanded huge monetary reparations as well as massive land annexations from Germany, and would have enlarged the Netherlands from 30 to 50%, but current German occupants would have to be deported, and it was dropped after the US dismissed it because of the need to rebuild West Germany against communism. This, coupled with the loss of Indonesia that the Netherlands went through after a 4.5-year war ending in 1949, didn't sit well with the Dutch, and as a result, they went through with Operation Black Tulip, which deported 3,691 Germans to a concentration camp after being declared enemy subjects. The US responded by expelling the Dutch living in the Allied occupied zones of West Germany. This is important because we see how the Allies helped the Dutch by airdropping food, but we also see how they ignore the Dutch and celebrate their victories in Europe, and how they would sometimes bomb innocent civilians like in Anton's case. We also see how even though the Nazis subjugated the Dutch, they allowed the Allied bombers to drop food to the hungry masses, and they gave Anton food and clothing when he needed it. We also see in episode 4 a divide between former members of the resistance and how some would favor America and some would favor the Soviets. As one resistance member said, the Americans came to our rescue, the Russians also came to our rescue, and how the Russians have been de-Stalinized, but the Americans have become mass murderers. The Bakker-Schut Plan also didn't help because the US denied the Netherlands the possibility of returning the favor to Germany. This relates to the idea of how there was very little indication of who was right, who was wrong, and who to support at this time. After the war, the Dutch returned to the pillarized society and maintained a conspiracy of silence where they victimized themselves as the target of Nazi aggression and maintained the idea that many people were a part of the resistance movement, while denying that many people also collaborated with the Nazis, and it was also a way for them to feel better about themselves. As Hendaius at the time put it, now is the time for Jews to remind themselves all the time that they have to be thankful. They are certainly not the only ones who had a bad time and who suffered. As time passed, the Dutch actually began to believe their own conspiracy of silence, so much so that this led to the dismantling of the pillarization system that once again dated back to the 13th century. Many people applied for the pensions awarded to the members of the resistance, and a number of these people didn't actually participate in the resistance, and many war criminals were either pardoned or given very light sentences. Part of this is explored by Takes in episode 4, where he's deeply upset by the release of Willy Lages and the treatment he's getting despite the crimes he committed. As he says, "The war criminals is sick, oh dear, the poor lamb. Free the fascists quickly, for we're no fascists, our hands are clean." And who will be the first to approve of this release? All those who kept their hands clean during the war. Those who actively took part in the war could end up like Takes, while the war criminals are treated by people who claim they cannot act as their enemy despite having no first-hand experience with them. There were 4 major ideas I wanted to cover in this video. 1. The idea of the pillarized society where people are separated into different sections, and how certain people don't fit into these sections. 2. The ideology and opinions over the Allies and the Cold War, how they differed, and how they created much confusion in the Netherlands over right and wrong. 3. The idea that the Dutch lied to themselves to make them seem better people than they actually were, and how they ignored the plight of the Jews in the Netherlands. And 4. The idea that the war criminals in the Netherlands were released or given light sentences by the people who didn't take part in the resistance, while the actual members of the resistance were forgotten in the conspiracy.